I thought I was done with this crap. 1 year. 1 year of mainly ignoring Doctor Who and everything associated with it, and it was glorious, and has done wonders for my blood pressure. My opinion on the show has not changed, and my opinion on the upcoming RTD era has not changed. I got called every name in the book, and then some, when I stated that it would just be more of the same, just better written. I was done with the culture war, and wanted to go on to do other things. I was happy just sitting in the background, laughing at the head-scratchingly idiotic stories that came out. I was one of those that would have had very little interest in RTD2 anyway, even if it wasn't shaping up the way it seems to. The last 5 years have left a permanently sour taste in my mouth, and I now refuse to recognize anything after 1996. It was the asinine, elitist pomposity of practically everybody currently involved with this franchise that spurred me to come back. For now. What most people think started around 2015 and completely took over in 2018 was pretty much there from the beginning. By this I mean 2005, but it was much more subtle. Hindsight is always 20/20, as they say. RTD did have an agenda, but it wasn't front and center. His main focus seemed to be on creating or recreating a great show. But if you look at the sequence of events over the nearly 2 decades that followed, it was clear from the beginning where things were going. And we didn't look at this kind of stuff in 2005 and 2006 anyway. The world was a much better place and much more accepting of everyone back then. Now it's a world where groups that are deemed marginalized are given supervillain powers to destroy you if you so much as look at them the wrong way. They have become a protected class in the worst way possible, the same way other classes were in the past. But this little fact seems to fly over their heads. Or perhaps it doesn't. Let's just say most of them are not very nice people. Time for a disclaimer. Some people ask why I often use disclaimers in my videos, and the answer is quite simple. Taking people out of context is a bit of a problem lately. Many do it intentionally for their own grifting purposes, while others do it because they lack the intelligence to properly contextualize anything anyway, and regardless, they are all too obsessed with the message because modern day brainwashing and narcissism is definitely a thing. Some of them also benefit directly from the message because the concept of earning anything in this world has long since gone out the window. That's why I'm still debating identifying as a carrot. Now where's my money? There's nothing wrong with creating content for certain groups, as long as it's legal, and well, this show is pushing that line too lately in a very creepy way. More on that later. But back to my main point. Take as an example the recent film Bros. This was directed, or should have been directed, at a very small audience, and the budget should have reflected that. Instead, $22 million was spent on this, and that number doesn't take into account marketing. How the hell did this cost $22 million? Blumhouse can make great horror films, and many not very good horror films, for less than $5 million, and you spent $22 million on this. What, did the effects budget spiral out of control? Then, of course, the film only made $14 million globally and became a bit of a financial disaster. It didn't help that the usual suspects decided to insult their potential viewers, because that's always worked so well in the past. Nothing makes somebody want to consume your product like calling them a bigot. Had the people behind this film not been complete asshats, and the film had a reasonable budget, received a limited release, or perhaps gone straight to streaming, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. It's not your film or the subject matter that got people pissy, contrary to what many people claim. This isn't 1955 anymore. No, you created your own problem by acting like 5-year-olds and not understanding the scope of your potential audience. But what we're talking about in this video isn't an original work, is it? We've spent the last 6 or so years talking about the hijacking of every IP in sight for ideological purposes, with Doctor Who being one of the early casualties. There's a saying called jumping the shark. You may have heard it. It refers to a moment when a franchise has reached its peak and starts a noticeable decline, or when a show has become so far removed from what it was originally intended to be that it's barely recognizable from what it once was. The decline in quality for New Who began in the Moffat years, although I personally thought his first season was New Who's best, and then it jumped the shark completely in 2017 when it announced a certain casting choice, although it would be more than a year before the ramifications of this would become fully apparent. Then, in 2020, Chibs the Destroyer rewrote the show's entire backstory for the purposes of the message. Then it was announced that RTD was coming back, and many thought this would be hitting the reverse button on all that shark jumping. But I, and many others, were not fooled for a second. We had seen the hateful bile that had come out of RTD's mouth in recent years. We knew what the BBC was all about now. We knew that the show had been poisoned at every level, and RTD wasn't going to change this. Again, Nobody is saying that this content shouldn't exist, except the stuff that should be illegal, and you're a moron if you don't know what I'm talking about, so please don't put words in my mouth. But you will anyway, so what's the point of even saying this? This is not what Doctor Who was ever about. Simpletons will say, but it's always been progressive. Not like this it wasn't. Good science fiction, like Doctor Who or classic Trek, will look at an issue from multiple perspectives, and often let the viewer decide which is the right side and which is the wrong. And it didn't tackle the same issue over and over again. It didn't take one side, completely ignore the other side of the argument, and say anybody that disagrees with their side is not welcome in fandom and is the worst of humanity. Checks and balances were put in place, but those don't exist anymore. This wasn't your show to completely remake to appeal to only a small percentage of the population. And even within that small percentage, only a small percentage even want anything to do with it. The rest can see exactly what you're doing and are having none of it. But then, now it seems to have narrowed to focusing on material that only appeals to a small fraction of that percentage anyway. It wasn't just what was on screen that was pissing us off. It was the outright contempt for long-term fans and replacing them with a bunch of fake activists. The BBC has always been elitist, but what we're seeing now is on a completely different level. The advent of social media hasn't helped their image much either, but there is a difference between then and now. The BBC used to make some of the best television programming in the world. What we were forced to sit through in North America, especially sitcoms, seemed inferior by comparison. Their documentaries were brilliant, and even though they thumbed their noses at science fiction, they created some of the best sci-fi franchises in history. Even less than 10 years ago, most of the television I watched was British, and it was quite frustrating that I had to resort to other means to see it because it wasn't on DVD or carried on any channel in my area. Things are quite different now in 2023. What used to make some of the best programming in the world now makes unwatchable bile. What used to employ some of the best creatives in the industry has replaced them with incompetent and untalented woke activists. Anybody that's still around from the old days has had to sell their soul for the sake of the message, and apparently they threw their talent out the window. Either that or they just don't care anymore. Even if you weren't being hit on the head with a spiked hammer with a message, the scripts were terrible. Cast can't act, directors don't know how to direct, and effects people seem to be at the level of first-year graphic arts students from 1997. One of the things that stood out to me about the Chibs era, beyond the message, was just how terrible everything looked and sounded. Soft focus, almost to the point of being out of focus. Color correction that looked like it was done by somebody who suffers from color blindness, a horrible soundtrack that sounded like the hands of a 5-year-old mashing their fingers on a keyboard, and if you claimed the composer was anything less than a musical genius, then you were a candidate for cancellation. There was a phenomenon that was always present in fandom from the time the show came back. A small group of fake activists, and worse, slowly wormed their way in over the course of a decade. Unfortunately, after everything went to hell in 2018, they were able to completely take over fandom. This was partly because so many had just walked away from the show, but mainly because anybody that wasn't part of this group and didn't wholeheartedly accept the message would be ostracized. You would be banned from forums where fans used to congregate, banned from Facebook groups, terrorized on Twitter, and in some cases, much, much worse. You'd see creators and actors from the show, both old and new, worship these degenerates while attacking the rest of us. We who kept the show alive during the wilderness years. We who were the reason the show came back. We who were the ones who made it successful again, and we who stood by the show when it started to fall apart during the later Moffat years. Attacking the fans was a common practice as franchises, one after one, were falling. But there was something just so nefarious about the way this was done to now mostly former Doctor Who fans. Now let's go to last spring. As I said, I was pretty much done with New Who. You just can't force yourself to like something again when you have spent 5 years covering its demise in graphic detail. I didn't think anything would change under RTD, but I was mildly curious. Then came the announcement of Ncuti Gatwa as the 14th or I guess 15th Doctor. Contrary to what the fake activists said my initial response was quite different. While I wasn't a fan anymore, I was somewhat interested as a casual viewer. I was thinking, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll focus on story again. Maybe the show will at least be watchable again. That lasted for only a couple of hours, and then there was the now infamous scene on the red carpet.
You know, Doctor Who aside, both of you up for so many awards today. It's really celebratory because TV has meant more than ever, I think, over the last year, the last couple of years. What has it meant to you?
I have just loved seeing the strides taken in terms of representation, and I think like there's a lot more that we can do. There's a lot being done.
Yeah,
there's
honestly.
a lot of wonderful things being done. But yeah, just seeing the diversity on screen is been great, and pushing that is, yeah.
I feel like we've all got a lot bolder with the messages and the conversations that we're opening up using TV, via TV.
With that clip, hopes that things would be better were dashed in an instant. We know what those buzzwords diversity and inclusion and so forth mean. Then the fake activists went into overdrive, and the fraction of the fandom that was left was divided in half again. It was shortly after this that I decided I was out. 5 years, the first 3 trying to save the franchise, and the last 2 watching it burn itself to the ground was enough. I was done with the culture war. I was sick of it, and I figured it was going to come to an end soon anyway, because how the hell could anybody afford to sustain this? But it keeps going. As stated, my initial goal was to save the show. Sadly, it now seemed obvious that there was no chance of saving it now. From there, I just shook my head at news as it came through on my Twitter feed. First, there was what I can only call a bait and switch. Oh look, it's David Tennant, he's coming back. This will bring people back, surely. Well, it will bring some back, at least for the first of his 3 episodes as a novelty. Don't know if it's going to make much of an impact over here in the US and Canada. The show is done here. The final nail in the coffin was Arachnids in the UK, which was intended as a 40-minute insult to Americans. Also, the show over here exploded under Matt Smith, not David Tennant, and Matt Smith won't even do Big Finish audios. More on them later. Also, allow me to reference Star Trek Picard Seasons 1 and 2. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Context disclaimer time again, so those of you madly writing angry comments might as well skip ahead because you're just going to ignore these anyway. Those of us in the normal world don't care what you do with your own life. We don't care what you identify as. You just do you, and we'll do our own thing. We have a problem when you are given powers to police people based on language, and force the use of language when you infiltrate long-standing fandoms, and those in power place you at the top and tell everyone else to shut the hell up and listen to your betters, and when you try to push your beliefs on 5-year-olds, you know, people whose brains are still developing, without the permission of their parents, then yeah, that's when we have a problem. We don't judge you based on who or what you are. We judge you based on your actions. When it came to fandom, this group, which was only a very small fraction of fandom previously, as I said, completely took over, and they were some of the nastiest and most unhinged people, honestly some of the worst people I've ever come across. I did battle with them for years, and often got called out by the elitist asshats that run this franchise for daring to challenge the new overlords of fandom. Many fans, actually, most fans, simply left. Great marketing strategy, BBC. Put all your weight behind the people that were actively chasing away your customers, as if what's happening on television screens wasn't enough already to send people running for the hills. So, needless to say, anybody that was considering coming back was understandably apprehensive about this certain group. It's not that we were saying you had no right to be fans or participate in fandom, that's what you were telling us. But if RTD, the BBC, and Bad Wolf were really interested in bringing fans back, then it might have been a good idea to stop the pandering to what was a small fraction that was allowed to completely take over, or at least pump the brakes a bit. But nope, the Tennant bait and switch was followed by this announcement. Doctor Who's Yasmin Finney says Rose casting will change the world. The word I don't think I'm even allowed to say anymore, actress, will be making her Doctor Who debut. Back in the day, I would cover the entire article by yelling at it, but in this case, I don't think we need to. The headline tells you everything you need to know. If you wanted to endear yourself to anyone, a better idea would be to humbly accept your role, be grateful, and not go on about your political identification! But no, here we're going to change the world. Now, where have we heard this before? This isn't about the show, it's about the message. It's about narcissism. It's about anything but a man who travels through time in a police box. I just stood by the sidelines for this one and watched Twitter explode while good-intentioned but ultimately incorrect fans tried to downplay it. The writing was on the wall, folks. This is about pushing an agenda. I wonder what Sony thinks about all this. Then we learned that this character that was asexual for decades, at least until RTD gave us that cringy Rose 10th Doctor storyline, was now going to be gay because why stay true to what a character was? The character's already been thrown out the window anyway. I think you're confused, Russell. This isn't queer as folk. Then in the new year came a trifecta of announcements that left no doubt where this was all headed, starting with a god-awful trailer heard round the world. Meet Doom, the universe's greatest assassin. At first, I thought this was a joke or a very bad fan film. But no, it was serious. A cross-platform dumpster fire that nobody asked for. When the trailer was met with almost universal disdain, we all started being called bigots again. This mystified some people at first. Wait, why are we bigots just for disliking a trailer? Then we found out that Suze Kemper is somewhat of an activist for the message. Then it all made sense. At this point, people were starting to realize what was going on. Also, the elitists in charge of Doctor Who, as usual, didn't do much to ingratiate themselves. Here's a tweet from a Big Finish writer and script editor. Note to the trolls of Who fandom. Trolls? By that you mean your customers. You know, the people that pay your bills. Try not to take on a comedian who has already had far bigger people than you coming at her. Actually, most of us had no idea who the hell she was, and if people were coming at her, then I can only think it was her ego that initiated it. Also, the word comedian might be a bit of a stretch. It's like watching Star Wars fans tangle with Carrie Fisher. No, Carrie Fisher was an iconic actress. Again, nobody knows who the hell this is. She is smarter and funnier than you. You will lose. That's quite a bit of ass kissing to the deliverers of the message there. Also, I guess the concept of humor is one that is not in any way objective. Also, it ain't gonna be the fans, i.e. your customers, that will lose. I could imagine that many people won't want to renew their Big Finish subscriptions after this. I mean, why would you want to give your money to a company that holds you in such contempt? Then came another announcement. This person that I've never heard of before, who identifies as that word I can't say, has now joined the cast. There's representation, Russell, but I can't help but think we're in the realm of over-representation now. Then came the announcement that was the final straw for most people. Drag is not a new thing, and I categorize this under a you do you type of thing, as long as it's not illegal. But the drag issue has been surrounded by controversy recently, the source of which has been the exposure of very young children to, risque drag shows revealing things that no child should see. There are people out there that have made it clear that their intention is to indoctrinate your kids. You don't need to be a biological science person to understand that young brains are highly malleable, so this isn't a good thing, to put it mildly. If you want to perform this stuff in front of adults, fine, but people have very good reason to not want to subject their kids to this. Doctor Who is, above anything else, a children's show, and that's really the only fact that we need to know here. This has no place in a children's show, and considering what's been going on, you know, the real world right now, this is not a good look, and parents have every right to be suspicious. The response from Twitter was, as expected, explosive, and those that were able to take over fandom during the years of Chibs the Destroyer now claimed full victory, and well, you can't really argue with them there, now can you? The BBC responded to this by burying thousands of tweets trying to portray the image that everyone was behind this. Yeah, they aren't, and many parents will no longer be allowing their kids to watch this show. Apparently on Facebook they were just deleting tweets and blocking people. I wouldn't know because I left Facebook a while ago. The dumpster fire known as Twitter is enough for me, and that's just a rough overview of where the show is now, and it's not in a good place. My sincere sympathies to those that thought the show was saved. And that's all I have for today, but stay tuned for more. I'm Chris from Cultivated Media, and as always everyone, thank you for watching, and have a great day.